I am overrepresented in fantasy. Not just because I'm a white dude, but also because I'm a human. Humans are so often the focus of our fantasy stories. Their points of view are privileged, and for some unknown reason, nearly every fantasy world has some sort of human majority. But compared to elves and dwarves, we're powerless, unimpressive, and weak. Should humans even exist at all in a world filled with other fantastical species? First, let's look at some common arguments given in the fantasy community. Usually, people suggest that humans are such excellent generalists, so creatively potent or so good at making babies that we dominate even the most wild and most strange fantasy worlds. Let's investigate these in reverse order. Humans have a gestation period of 9 months and an average of just over 1 child per pregnancy. Compare that to standard presentations of goblins or even fantasy creatures who use eggs or spawn to create children, and humans are relatively slow and inefficient. When lizard folks or frog people can create dozens or hundreds of offspring at once, humans don't really have so much of a competitive advantage here. Perhaps we do beat out the traditionally very slow elven baby-making process, but when it comes to technical skill or creative potential, we are again surpassed. In most fantasy worlds, dwarven and elvish creations are simply superior to the greatest human efforts. This makes sense. Their civilizations are usually presented as older and more stable, and dwarven forging or elven magics are legendary. Let's be honest, any great master of their craft being able to survive for a few hundred extra years is gonna do an awful lot for their lifetime output, and might even make for greater skill ceilings available than in a single human lifetime. But Tom, you say, the human capacity for ingenuity and creative problem solving is unsurpassed. Really? Yeah, on Earth, we are probably the first and only creature to make tools that have the sole purpose of making it easier to make different tools. We have achieved some wondrous things, but in a fantasy world without any special capacity for magic, we may end up stunted, even in the ingenuity and creativity regard. While gnomes are often seen as very tech-savvy folks, fully on board the creative inventiveness train, the civilizations of elves and dwarves have likely already done much of what makes human achievement interesting by the time we get our first farm going. But that's not fair. I've been comparing humans to other species where they're strongest. It doesn't matter if the average orc is stronger than the average man, that kobolds are far more numerous than we are, or that dwarves make better arms, because humanity's strength is generalism, right? We can do everything well enough. We can take a hit better than a wispy elf, jump higher and climb better than dwarves, make more complex machines than goblin folk, and strategically outmaneuver an orcish horde in the field. How useful is this, though? When dealing with sapient creatures, especially in land disputes and tribalistic conflicts, each side seeks to push its advantage, because they're not stupid, and because they don't want to lose or die. So, the orcs will raid, goblins swarm with their superior numbers, elves will fill foes with arrows from afar, and dwarves won't compete in limbo and skipping competitions instead of all-out war. If your foes are intelligent, they will exploit their strengths and your weaknesses, and ultimately, in such a situation, humans just don't have that many impressive strengths to leverage. But humans do have strengths. We aren't perfect generalists, after all. We are good at domesticating creatures and shaping the natural world to suit our needs. We are deeply ambitious and have one clear physical advantage over every other creature in a fantasy world. We are pretty much the best long-distance endurance runners in existence. I'm serious. A human can outrun a horse, a lion, and a cheetah at a long enough distance, maintaining a higher average speed than all three. Orcs are too naturally muscular. Hobbits and dwarves too short. Elves too lithe. Humans are exceptional at this one specific thing. Before we get into exploring what this means, though, in most fantasy worlds, there's one other way that humans are generally demonstrated as being rather special. We are, how to say this delicately, probably the most biologically compatible of all of the fine fantasy folk. Of course, this is likely just the ill-disguised desires of fantasy authors everywhere, but it is a ubiquitous enough point of fact that it merits inclusion here. I imagine most of the reasoning, if there is any, is that humans are so basic that adding in a bit of human into some other species isn't that likely to go wrong, leading many fantasy worlds to include semi-humans or half-somethings. So with all this, we finally start to see humans' place in a fantasy world. Not living in mountains, cave systems, or deep in verdant forests, but rather thriving on vast savannas and plains. An environment where threats can be seen approaching, where a semi-nomadic lifestyle is possible, and where our endurance running capabilities are on full display. Yes, in our own world we've adapted to hunt, thrive, and survive in so many other environments, but with the elves in the forests, dwarves in the mountains, and the threat ever present of orcs and goblins, humans would likely be rather hemmed into this plain savanna niche, after all. So we likely have a collection of tribes operating across a vast plain, most likely warring in amongst themselves, but rallying together to keep the plains and its creatures safe from outsiders. As persistence predators and omnivores, humans chase prey over long ranges while also engaging in agriculture, foraging, and animal husbandry. We can expect human settlements to look originally quite similar to how we usually arrange ourselves in the ancient world, just with less opportunity to roam around or use vast quantities of wood. But what about our rather unique compatibility? How could humans in this world reasonably develop past the Iron Age? Well, the trouble with being an elf is that you have a child if you're very dedicated, perhaps every 100 years. With the pace of the world, of wars, plagues, and progress, that's an awfully long time. So any hit to an elven population echoes and ripples on a much grander scale than even in our own human history. A long-lived society with a low birth rate is incredibly vulnerable to population collapse. And if it gets bad enough, they may well need to introduce humans to the gene pool. Species used to waging vast, all-out wars with their entire populace on the line, like orcs, may find themselves in the same boat. They may actually require human genetic material to rebuild their own civilizations after devastating losses. Considering this, it is likely that humans, as time goes on, may become a minority diasporic population among the societies of many different species. Having a human around is useful. After all, they don't have remarkably tough carapaces, supernatural strength, wings, or magic in any exceptional sense, so they make wonderfully non-threatening servants. It's likely that they may even be bought and sold as breeding stock, or cheap but intelligent labour, perhaps forming a culture among the human homelands of raiding and selling neighbouring tribes off to the elves or whoever's buying. In the absence of powerful communications magic or technology, especially in low magic worlds, humans would serve as pretty much the best messengers. They have enough sense to avoid danger along the way while also being the best endurance athletes on the planet. Far better than, say, a bird who can only take a pre-written message, not one delivered with a subtle voice and the nuances of pleasantries, and far less likely at risk from the dangerous denizens of the world. With all this said, I envision the human lands developing to have pockets of well-fortified cities, most likely made of stone, surrounded by tribal satellite villages. Those few tribes who gain massive wealth exploiting their fellow humans build these cities that become crossroads and melting pots of travellers, merchants, and messages. These stone cities serve as relay points in the exchange of information worldwide. Perhaps the human trade of choice becomes information, synthesizing the achievements of those other species who let them in and made them work, enabling the fusion of cultures who themselves refuse to collaborate. Humans, being non-threatening, become mediators, diplomats, all the while sending their new discoveries and secrets learned right back home. After all, even if the dwarves have now built a nice little human district, it doesn't stop the fact being true that the original human minority was captured and put to work, labouring or to fix population problems, seen as this unthreatening, unrevolutionary weakling species. We have plenty of historical examples in our own world of the long-term problems, ethically and socially, in trying to keep other humans under lock and key, punished, and forcing them to work. Now imagine that it's not humans committing generational horrific violence against our fellow man, but those so-called advanced species. For the first time in fantasy or real history, it may be that humans all share a common goal, a common enemy: everyone else. After all, even though these diasporic communities are now free, that doesn't mean humans aren't doing the dirty work. Except humans are carrying the messages of these civilizations. The human cities of the plains are neutral ground where disagreements amongst these grand ancient civilizations are put to rest. In fact, slowly but surely, humans have made their way to a point of some importance in the world's political landscape. They have some familiarity with most cultures due to the problems that come from being so compatible, and they've established enclaves in cities throughout the world. And, to boot, they've proven themselves capable of discretion and resourcefulness. As long as humans can remain useful to the species who require them around, as insurance, I believe that their unassuming, non-threatening, non-specialized existence makes them great in just one more thing: adaptation. In a world transitioning towards global communications, trade, and the integration of technology, magic, and all species, humans' generalized skill set, and in this case, their experience under the boot of different creatures around the world, sets them up to adapt better than anyone to change. As the elven forests show signs of shrinking, as the mithril veins die out, as goblin warfare struggles more and more with great stone walls and siege defences, the time of humans might dawn. They're still a minority in most other species' lands, but the plains becomes this melting pot of ideas. Human cities are the most forward-looking of them all, and as technological progress runs away with civilization, the ones who can keep up are likely those kept down for so long. In summary, I don't actually think that we should be avoiding using humans in our... They can serve to make fiction more relatable, comprehensible, and better show contrast, but I do find that assumption that humans are somehow the majority of fantasy citizens at any point just a little bit ludicrous. We're simply not good enough to compete with most other fantasy species in a fair or unfair fight. My recommendation would be towards eliminating any assumption you might have about this human baseline, this human majority in a fantasy world that includes any other species, and to consider more what space you want humans to have in your world building. After all, we're constantly debating and interrogating what hobbits or halflings or elves stand for, what function they serve in our fantasy tales. We always ask, should I include dragons? Giants? Will they make my world ridiculous or unbelievable? Why not do at least that courtesy for humans too? They certainly don't need to be there, and some works of fantasy fiction would simply be better if they weren't. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into what exactly the point of us is. If you want some videos discussing what actually a fantasy person is, please do let me know, because I think that sounds like an interesting concept. And if there's any other video ideas that you have, please let me know what you'd like me to talk about in the comments, and subscribe to the channel, please. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.